Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today is a guest episode. This is my monthly episode with Brandon DaCruz. So we dive into a little Q&A. So some topics that we discuss here are we update on our training nutrition. We talk a little bit about sleep in terms of maybe you're not. We talk about my sleep specifically, how I'm sleeping close to 6 to 7 hours, and is it important to go off of that or how you feel? And if you feel good and you feel like you're sleeping well, what changes do you need to make, or do you need to make any changes there? So we talk about that. Again, we dive into our training and nutrition in terms of what we're currently working on, and then we get into the question portion and we talk about cardio after lifting. We talk about most common dieting mistakes that hold people back from achieving a lean physique. Is it possible to maintain muscle once muscle is built, but progressive overload is not there? We talk about how long you need to be in a training cycle and why 4 to 6 weeks is probably a little too short. And so we talk about that. And then we finish up with some things that we changed our mind on recently. Hint, we talk about deloads specifically there. So definitely make sure you go and check this out. It's a great conversation between us. Always fun to just go back and forth and to catch up with Brandon on these topics. So hope you guys enjoy that. First, though, if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active. And then do have coaching spots open if you are looking to, if you're 30 plus and looking to take your training, nutrition, performance, body comp, or recovery to the next level, or maybe you're just stuck and you're not sure on where to go. Coaching spots are open, and I always want to continue to work with more motivated people. If you're interested in that, the link to that is in the show notes, or you can reach out to me on Instagram. Without further ado, let's dive into today's episode with Brandon.
What's going on, guys? This is Brandon DaCruz, host of the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. And today I've got with me Jeff Hain, host of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Jeff and I are back for episode 4 of our monthly podcast collab, where each month we will answer your questions or dive into topics that will benefit both of our audiences, whether you're a coach, you're a fitness enthusiast, you're one of our clients, or you're someone that's simply chasing a healthier, leaner, and more muscular physique. This series is all about bridging the gap between evidence and real-world application. So we'll be tackling everything from training and nutrition to recovery, lifestyle strategies, and anything else that helps you look, feel, and perform your best. Jeff, let's start by doing our quick catch up on how things are going from a nutrition, training, and business perspective. So what's going on your end, my man?
Yeah, dude, good to be back on here. I was looking forward to this. Always fun to catch up regularly like this and just chat like you were saying off air, man. It's always fun to go back and forth on this and really dive into training, nutrition stuff. And yeah, man, like I said, I was looking forward to this. Yeah, as far as training goes, it's like in a month, it's like a lot ends up not really happening from that perspective. However, I did kind of like I was saying last time, I wanted to go back down to 3 days of weight training for a little bit with a little bit more cardio, just test it out. And as I was kind of telling you last time, I don't like 3 days a week of weight training because I still at the end of the day, man, like I still love like building muscle. Like I still want to try and be like, I just want to continue to focus on that. I love cardio too now. That's definitely something I've continued to enjoy more. I love the difference in terms of how I feel after each one and just it's a little bit different. But I just don't like how the 3 days, like I end up trying to fit way too much in 3 days. And it's like the sessions just become a little long. So I went back to 4 days. And so I'm back to 4 days and this setup way better. The workouts are 45, 60-ish minutes. So I like that setup a lot better. I'm back to that. I still have the cardio sprinkled in there because again, I'm ultimately just still trying to figure out how I can be as jacked and as good of cardio shape as I can within my current constraints, even though they're really not that bad. At the end of the day, I have one freaking kid and I get to work from home. My constraints really are not that bad from that perspective, but that's what my goal is right now. Like I said, I love the weight training side of things, but then again, I just love the way I feel after cardio. It's like a different kind of feeling in terms of how I feel when I do my cardio sessions. And so some days it's like really nice. I just feel like I'm like, I don't know, I'm just getting energy out. It just feels really good. It's just a little bit different there, but that's it, dude. Other than that, still eating around maintenance, smallish kind of surplus. So just making sure I'm well fueled and just having some flexibility. Like we've talked about, I don't track exact calorie and macros right now, but I still follow that setup of, hey, 4 meals a day, have a couple around around my training sessions, just to make sure I'm fueled and then recovering. And those are the main things that I'm working on right now. So nothing crazy has changed there that I can think of. But yeah, man, that's where I'm at from a training perspective. Is like I was telling you, it's like not a lot changes in a month in terms of what we do. Is continue to just go in there, get it done, and just stay consistent with it, right? That's, I think, the biggest thing with it. So what about you?
No, one thing I do want to ask, and this comes from one of my good friends, Mickey Williden. I want to know what your sleep is because that was something that she told me I had to badger you about this. So what's been going on with your sleep quality, sleep length? Have you seen any improvements? Because I know that on one of our, I believe it was our last podcast that we linked up for, you had just gotten blood work back and there were some markers that were off. They weren't significantly off, but there were certain things that you were seeing that could have been precipitated by your sleep quality being off.
Yeah, I think okay, so I think sleep quality is solid because I really do feel like I wake up, I feel fairly good. And again, I think the only thing is when I do get a little bit less sleep, and I'm talking six, when I kind of hit that 6 hour mark, which sometimes does happen. So, but I feel like sleep quality is overall solid. It's just more so the time spent in bed that I think is the biggest thing for me. That some days I wake up like, damn, I should have went to bed a little bit earlier. But Mickey, yeah, she definitely called me out on the caffeine side of
Caffeine,
things. But yeah, dude,
which
like,
even if you don't feel it, it does
yeah,
hinder sleep quality because of its
absolutely.
interference with delta sleep and then also with REM sleep.
Absolutely, dude. And I've talked to you about this too. I don't have, yeah, part of it is because I do have to train a little bit later in the day. I'm not a huge fan of that. I definitely like, if it was a perfect role, I would train between now and 5 p.m. because that's when I feel best. And when I train it not later in the night, I feel like that's part of the reason why I don't have that oomph is because it's like training at night. I'm just like, usually that's my kind of wind down. I like to wind down around that time. And I can feel that that's what my body is used to now at this point. So I think that's part of it. I've told you in the past, I don't have that extra oomph in my training as much as I would like. And I'm sure, again, it comes back to sleep quality for sure. But that is the biggest thing is I tell myself 10:30 is the absolute latest that I can stay up and I need to get in bed. Sometimes I go slightly later than that, depending on when I got done working out and if I want it to if I'm watching. I've been super into ever since I found out that I wasn't into this at all, but Artemis 2, going to the moon, basically, right? So now I'm like super into space stuff. I just got super into it, looking at the old Apollo missions, all that stuff. So I've been super into that, watching documentaries on that. And sometimes I stay up a little late watching that and maybe some hockey as well, too, because it's playoff season. So, in saying this long story, I definitely find myself going to sleep a little bit later. And then I still, because I want to wake up before Colby gets up, I end up waking up between 5 and 5:30. We're talking, I'm probably in bed 6 to 7 hours. And so I just think from that, that's probably something that, again, I'm somewhat tired, but overall I feel good. But I definitely know that it would be way better if I got probably another hour of sleep. I'm probably missing an hour of sleep. And I think in the short term, that's not a big deal. But when you zoom out long term, it does start to add up. So it's a little bit better, but that is definitely something that I have to stay on top of for sure. Because it's weird. I grew up as a night owl. That was kind of my habits growing up. So I still have a little bit of that. And I used to hate the mornings, but now I freaking love the morning. So it's like I don't want to necessarily go to bed way earlier, but I also love to wake up early. So it's like that's where I find myself in that 6 to 7 hour mark in terms of sleep.
And it's so interesting because I can relate. I was a night owl all through early adolescence into early adulthood, all the way through college. And really was the things that changed this was I became a personal trainer in college. So I started personal training in 2010. And so I started getting early clients. And those were the clients that were like the most dialed in. They were the people that were most consistent with packages. And so I wanted to accommodate them. So I started getting up earlier, but it was at the sacrifice of sleep length. So I'd still go to bed 10, 11 o'clock, and I'd be up at 4 o'clock or 4:30 to make sure I was there for my 5 a.m. client. Then when I transitioned out, so I stopped personal training in 2013 when I got a very large corporate position that required travel. And what I initially did during that transitionary period, I was already doing people's nutrition in the gym, though. I was doing it almost like a hybrid. So I would have people come in that were personal training clients of mine. I would train them in person. I would do it in person. So we would even go into the back room. I had an office where I would do calipers and different things like the stand or the handheld BIA essentially.
Yep.
And we would do those type of body composition assessments. And then I would do their nutrition. And way earlier, like 2010 or 2011, I'm writing this down. And then I started taking notes on my phone or on my computer. And then I would email them the update later on that evening. So I would do the check-ins, I would do their sessions, I would do their check-ins in person. But when I got that opportunity and I had gotten a promotion within the sports nutrition industry and I became a regional rep at that time. So I not only covered New Jersey, but Pennsylvania and New York, it required much more extensive travel. So I was on the road every single day. What I initially did to just be able to have a transition was I took my clients and I tapered down my sessions and then I allocated them across the day. So meaning I would have 5, 6 a.m. clients. So I would train people till 7. I usually would get a training session if possible at 7 till 8:30, and I go right into work. So that was really my schedule. And then at night I would come back and I would do a couple of clients. But I went from having 40 personal training sessions a week to maybe 15 or 20. And then slowly but surely, I was able to take a lot of those clients. I had over 50% of the clients that I worked with in a personal training perspective come with me online. Now, this is early days of nutrition coaching online. So it's 2013. It's very hard to get people to really entrust in an online coach because they didn't even understand the concept. But I was fortunate because these people trusted me because they knew me in person. So easing them into the transition out of personal training and into online coaching was great for me. But then I kept that schedule early on because I was now doing check-ins. And so I kept, at that time, it was like this is 2013, so maybe 4:30 or 5 a.m. And slowly but surely, I backed it up. And by the time my online coaching really had gotten where I was with a lot of clients, it was like 2015 or 2016. Now I'm waking up before 4 a.m. so I could do a full block of check-ins. I could go into the office. I had an office in New York. At that time, I was a national sales director and head of research and development. So I had a 2-hour trip. So I was essentially doing check-ins on my computer for 2 or 3 hours in the early morning, 3 to 6 a.m. or 3 to 7 a.m. And then I was getting in my car. I was answering emails while driving. I don't recommend that to anyone, but answering just the respondents to clients, like little questions they had about the updates for that week. And then I was working all day. I was driving back, and then I was hitting the gym, and then I was essentially working until I fell asleep. And there was many years that I literally fell asleep at my laptop and my desk, or I would, a lot of times it would be on my dining room table day after day. So my sleep habits, I've been very open about this, were horrendous. But I will say that even when I transitioned out of corporate America, and that was in 2022, and I took this business full time, I kept that early morning wake up because for 2 reasons. A, it just really set up my day in a productive way where I get a very large block of check-ins done by around noon. Now, that doesn't mean my whole workday is done because I have people right now in 8 different time zones and all across the world. So almost at any time that I look at any 2 or 3 hour block, I'm having people check in. But the early morning break block that I do, which I wake up at 3:30 a.m. every morning, it allows me to get in touch with my international clients that have checked in overnight. And then I'm able to do the same thing with certain clients that are so far ahead of me that they're actually checking in the early afternoon. So I have certain clients that are checking in at 12 or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock Eastern time, essentially. And so I'm able to get back to them. So I've just kept that schedule. But I tell you, I've become such a morning person because I have such clarity of in terms of my ability to deliver things. Or even, I will say this quite bluntly, I have much better verbal fluency on my calls earlier in the day than I do when we podcast. But I do this because it's more of a relaxing thing that we decompress. This is the last thing that I'm going to do work-wise for this evening. I've gotten all my check-ins, all my client calls done for the day. But it's just been being able to wake up early and really set myself up as a morning lark, essentially, has really been such a productivity hack. And I can't tell you how many people that I've given that insight to or advice or suggestions, and they've tried it. And immediately it feels like shit. You're waking up early, you feel groggy. But once you're able to get yourself in that rhythm and really shift that circadian rhythm, it's a game changer in terms of productivity. So I do understand why you want to get up before your son. You want to get certain things done, whether that be creative work. We actually see, if you look at scientists, they do their best research work in the morning, or when we look at people that are in creative outlets, so that could be like art and things like that, music, that block early in the morning is seen to be the most productive and conducive to creative work or deeply intellectual work. So writing, things like that. So I just think that a lot of people are sleeping on getting up early, essentially. So instead of sleeping on sleeping in, they're sleeping on getting up early and getting things done.
I like doing my learning and continuing education first thing in the morning. That's my favorite thing. It's wake up, do my meditation, grab some coffee, then I get into continuing education, and then that gets my brain going, and that's where I try to do some creative type work there. So I've always stuck with that. Let me ask you this though. Again, with my blood work, it was like testosterone, I think, was still in the 700s. We did say, hey, free testosterone was a little bit on the lower end. SHBG was on the higher end. When I go to sleep at night, I'm out within, I feel like 5-ish minutes. I'm not tossing and turning. I don't wake up in the middle of the night. I sleep through the night. Would you say that's problematic? Or if you were in my situation, would you be like, I definitely think that, hey, like we talked about, okay, maybe when I'm closer to 6 hours, that's going to add up. But if I'm in that closer to 7-ish range, are you just going off how someone feels? Is it blood work? Is it resting heart rate? What are you looking at in that situation?
Yes. So I'm going to be honest. I was very deeply into sleep tracking for many years. I had an Aura Ring. As soon as Aura launched, I've tracked sleep through Aura Ring, through Apple Watch. I have all these devices still. Now, there is something that has been termed in the literature called orthosomnia, which is essentially like a phobia or a fear about not sleeping well. And that's actually, we see a very, almost like a hockey stick increase in that since sleep tracking has become more prominent. Because years ago, if you didn't get a testing done through polysomnography, which is in the lab where they put electrodes on your head, you didn't know how you slept. And so I think people get a little bit hyper fixated on some of the devices. We have to realize that there's large margins of error within these. So something like your Oura Ring or your Apple Watch are only really good for sleep duration because they are able to pick up on interruptions or nighttime wake ups because of the increase in heart rate or movement. So they're able to they have accelerometers essentially. So they pick up on ambulation, so arm movement or body movement. But really when it comes down to your sleep cycles and things like that, we just do not have, you cannot expect that a commercially available device like a Oura Ring that I believe is in the $300 to $400 range, or Apple Watch, which is probably in the same range, that they are going to have the sensitivity of analysis for those things. So I really do go off biofeedback. There is something called the Pittsburgh Sleep Index, which I often will refer back to, and it's a whole indice of sleep architecture essentially, and it's a validated questionnaire. And you can use that to really assess your sleep quality. And I think that's the most subjective ratings, I think, are often the most conducive to making adjustments. So if you were to tell me, man, I feel groggy, I feel cognitively burdened in the morning, I'm constantly getting up in the middle of the night, then I think it would be an issue. I don't think that what you're dealing with is necessarily knocking down your testosterone. We have to realize that your HPTA function is implicated or is influenced by so many factors. And then there's also, like we had discussed on the last podcast, there's so many issues with measurement, even the assays, that we don't really know unless, and that's why if someone, say, I'm just going to give an example, if someone was hypogonadal, so say that, Jeff, you came back at 200 nanograms per deciliter, you would have to get, technically, if you were to go to endocrinologist, and I'm fortunate because I have someone in my circle that is an endocrinologist I've discussed this with, you would have to go twice to get validated for testosterone replacement if you were doing it based on the medical systems approach, not like a wellness clinic and stuff like that, but they would want to dual check it to make sure that it wasn't just an error within the actual testing measurement. And so really what it comes down to, whether it be testosterone or sleep quality, I really do the subjective feedback, granted or given that the person actually has the ability to be objective about these things. Because here's the issue. I adapted at one time in my life to 4.5 to 5 hours of sleep. And I would have never known I slept that little until I got the Oura Ring. And until, I'm going to be honest with you, I have a very good friend. He's a great coach. His name's Joe Jeffrey. He's based in the UK. And he's someone that coaches mainly just IFBB professionals over there. But I remember we did many consultations over here. And this was someone I interacted with every day or every week for many years. And I'll never forget the first time he goes, Brendan, is this real data? He was looking at my sleep stuff. I had sent him over my sleep scores. And he was like, is this factual or did you forget to wear the ring? He was so thrown off. And it was one of the first times that someone gave me feedback in such a shocked manner that he was like, your sleep is literally shit. I'd never thought about it. I knew I was underslept. I knew I didn't feel great, but it was just such a part of my lifestyle. I was trying to build a business. I was running a very large supplement company in conjunction with a very successful coaching business. And I was trying to be everything to everyone. And I was running myself thin essentially, and I was burning the candle at both ends. And I just thought, hey, sleep is for the weak. And I had those same type of mantras. I remember I had a mentor that is in a different field. He's very successful within the sports nutrition industry. And he had the whole mentality that you should sleep quicker, which he got from Arnold, and that we would just compensate for a lack of sleep. So we used to do ice. We did 1 year where we committed to each other. We're going to do cold showers every single morning at 4 a.m. after 4 or 5 hours of sleep. So we did things to get a dopamine secretion, to get us amped and awake. But we were essentially riding off essentially fake energy, using a lot of caffeine, things like that. I look back in retrospect, myself then could not have given myself an objective sleep score, even from a subjective perspective. But if someone is in tune with their biofeedback, with how their body functions like yourself, and you know what's good sleep and what's low quality sleep, and you're able to say, dude, I feel pretty good. Obviously, my sleep's probably not as good as it was before I had a son or before I had a child. But at the same time, I don't feel like it's impairing. I generally do not think that's the only thing that's contributing to a lower free testosterone value.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I figured again, if all those things are lined up, which again, under the assumption that, like you said, you're not necessarily adapted to that amount, because that could totally happen, right? Where like you just become you just become accustomed to it, and it's okay. You could feel a lot better there. So that's why I'm always looking at it. Again, I feel like I think it all comes down to if I could get closer to that extra 30 minutes to an hour, I think it adds up in a positive. I think it adds up in a negative there. And so that's why I'm just wondering if it's safe, if I don't have trouble falling asleep and I'm not waking up in the middle of the night. And like you said, how do I feel when I wake up? I'm less concerned, but like I said, is it going to be something that could potentially add up over time? And so I think that's why I still need to stay on top of it and still make sure I'm going to bed early, because I could easily trick myself into being like, hey, yeah, I'm good, I feel fine. And it's like, that will start to add up there. But I agree with you. I think like all the sleep tracking and stuff, like you said, anything that's commercial, it's like you got to take all that with a grain of salt. Like you said, I think it is good at being like how long you're in bed and stuff like that, and how long you're asleep, but it's like the actual sleep stages, it's not very good at picking those up there. So like always going off that subjective feedback under the assumption that you can do that and you're not going to trick yourself there. How's everything going with your training and nutrition?
Yeah, man, everything's going pretty well on my end. I'm currently 26 weeks into this building phase. So I have about 2 or 3 weeks left to go, and then I'll transition to a fat loss phase. And to be honest with you, up until this week, the entire phase had gone off without a hitch. Then I will say, and I regrettably say this, but I strained my right pec this past weekend. It's probably the first setback that I've had this whole phase. So really right now, a lot of my focus is on incorporating recovery modalities, really what I'm trying to do, because a lot of it's in the pec tendon. It's almost in the insertion between my pec and then also my underarm and then, or my armpit rather, and then my bicep tendon. And I have torn my pec before on the other side. So I do, it's not a torn pec. I know the difference. I've had the pec roll up on myself. I had moderate bruising, but really what I'm trying to do is increase blood flow to that area. Anything tendon related has very poor blood flow. So I'm trying to increase blood flow. I'm trying to support nutrient delivery so I can get back to normal training really as soon as possible without compromising the rest of this phase. Luckily, I still do have some strength in that side. It's just, it's uneven. And so really what I'm doing is I'm running a few different modalities in multiple areas. So first thing, I come from the supplement industry, so I'm running some high dose curcumin and then other anti-inflammatory supplements. And I'm specifically staying away from NSAIDs in particular because NSAIDs cause me a lot of gastrointestinal issues first and foremost, but I also want to manage the inflammation because that's part of the repair process. So I want to manage it and make sure it's not excessive, but I also don't want to blunt it completely. And then I'm doing red light therapy, which I'm lucky I have a Huga box, like a massive box that I use all the time anyway, but I'm doing it in conjunction with certain modalities and then actually shining it right on the area itself because that helps with, that's been shown to help with local circulation and tissue support. And then when I am training, I'm doing like high rep, low load training on that area. I'm just trying to get blood flow. Unfortunately, if this was in my bicep itself, I could do some BFR.
I was going to say, yep.
Yeah, with the pec, the only research we have on pec activation in with BFR is on the bench press. And that's just a disadvantageous position to be with. I'm really trying to, I was doing a lot of deep lengthened range type of stuff. I feel better activation as well as a better stimulus, but I'm really having to go into more of the mid range because if you really think about the pec tendon in and of itself, where does it tear? I'll tell you personally, it tore a bench press for me many years ago. It generally tears, it's most strained in the deepest range of motion. So at the bottom of a movement where it's under deep stretch, that's where the pec is essentially most mechanically compromised. And that's going to, essentially aggravate this strain even more. And then I won't dive into this, but I am experimenting with some healing peptides. And the reason I'm not going to expand on it just because I don't want to influence other people to do these. I'm someone that I've been in this field for a very long time. And the purpose of myself experimenting with them is really to see independently, hey, I've had injuries before and I have utilized all these other modalities. The supplements, obviously, I've been using for many years and I use them intermittently, especially anytime I get a niggle or I get an ache, I will implement very similar stuff. I use the red light quite frequently. These are the type of training modalities I've switched to when I've had a niggle or an ache or a strain. But the healing peptides are going to be something that's a little bit a new variable. So I do want to check that out, or try that out. But other than that, man, I generally can't complain. I got to say, my clients are absolutely crushing it right now. I have a ton of people that are making really significant progress, especially as we head into summer. And then on the podcast side, we were just talking off air, but I'm just slammed in terms of my calendar's booked for the rest of the episodes I'll be recording this summer. I'm way ahead. So thank God for that. So I'm just really looking forward to continuing to grow both the business, the podcast, and then just really happy with how everything else is going. So really in the retrospect, the reason I say this is because I'm someone, I don't like discussing negativity. I don't know if you remember, I had surgery. I had a car accident many years ago, and then I had surgery. And many of you guys didn't even know I had been in a car accident because I just kept it to myself. Although I literally was having trouble sitting on the chair when I'd be on podcasts with you and Jeremiah. And it wasn't until I had surgery that I ended up saying something. I really don't like it. It's not that I have delusional optimism, but I really like to focus on the positives. And this is just a minor setback. And I really do try to take moments like this to reevaluate what I'm doing, but then also all the other good things I have in my life. Believe me, my cup is filled. And so, yes, I'm not going to be able to train to maximum capacity. I'm not going to be able to continue to progress loads right now. But this is a momentary thing. This is a temporary thing. I have so many other things in my life that are positive and conducive towards growth that I'm lucky to be in this type of headspace.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. I think it's important what the stories you tell yourself. And, I definitely think it's fine to, if you feel crappy about something, definitely recognize it. But I do think it's important to try and pull out the positives of things and I just think that leads to better outcomes. Again, sometimes it's probably tougher than others to be able to do that. And it's always easier to tell somebody else to do that than it is yourself when you're actually going through it. But anytime I felt that way, man, it's always better to think in terms of that. And it's easy to catch yourself talking to yourself negatively or just thinking negatively. And I'm just like, I just think, all right, got to snap out of this, man. It's like, I'm going down this bad rabbit hole. I got to get out of it there. And I love that. Especially, I think an injury is like a perfect example of that too, right? Of how what are the things I can control during this time? For you, is there anything from a training perspective that you would have done differently? Or was it just a freak accident type situation?
Man, I'll be honest with you. This entire mesocycle, when I look back, because I am an analytical person, I have all these things. It's not like I was making large jumps. I was making consistent jumps. I was back to a strength level that was quite high in comparison to the past years. It was just, I don't want to say a freak accident. It was just, I was on a top set and I had properly warmed up. It was an early morning. I had warmed up. I even did steps outside and it was warm that morning. before I went into the gym, I do a comprehensive warm up just because I've been doing this long enough that I have aches and pains to begin with. But yeah, it wasn't anything that was like precipitated by something. So it's not something I can look back and say, you made this mistake. But at the same time, I've been pushing hard for a long time. I've had probably one deload in 26 weeks. And it's not that I needed to deload on a more frequent basis, but there are just things that happen in life. One thing that could have confounded this was I did just have blood work literally the day before on that same arm. I'm not saying that was necessarily, but I will say the girl was jabbing in there. So potentially maybe I had some inflammation in that area and it just changed some of my biomechanics for that one side. But really, when I look back, this is things that happen. I always think about it like this. When I look back at my training career, I had the opportunity to train with many people that were far more talented than myself. I had a training partner that was on the Olympia stage. His name was Matt Mugford. He was also an athlete of mine. One of my longest training partners, his name's Kyle Wilkes. He's an Olympia level coach. He's coached Nick Walker. He's coached that freak Anton, that is the youngest classic physique pro. I worked out with people that I should not have been training with. I'm going to say that. And they buried me. And there was many times that I was trying to show up on a daily basis and putting myself through the fucking ringer because I wanted to earn their respect. And I also wanted to show up, and it didn't matter to me that I had less potential than them or less, I was genetically predisposed to different things. But I will say this, frankly, I put a lot of wear and tear on my body. And there's things I look back on that I did previously that I say I'm paying for now. And so I look at it from this perspective. This is not me saying regret. It's not. I have great experiences. This has given me the ability to tap into levels of effort and intensity that most people have never experienced. Not that I now, but I will say that I still have those memories and those experiences to call upon. And at the same time, I think about it in this context. I said this to a client on a consultation earlier today. We either pay for our sins or pay for our wins. And what I mean by that is when I was younger and I was in college, everyone was going out and drinking and using illicit drugs. I did not drink and I've never used an illicit drug. And so a lot of times when we're in our mid 30s, a lot of people feel banged up for one reason or another. It could be because they've been living a lifestyle that's subpar. They've been overstressed, underslept, drinking themselves to death every week. And every week it's the same type of revolving door of during the week, they bury themselves in work. And then during the weekend, they try to forget about it with alcohol or with substances. Never done any of those type of things. Two things I do is I work way too much and then I train hard. And so with that, there are certain niggles and aches and pains that I deal with. I've had surgeries. And honestly, the biggest surgery that I had was from a car accident that had nothing to do with me. I was stopped at a red light and I was hit by a distracted driver. That was the biggest issue I have, structurally, essentially. And it's given me issues for years. But I can't look back on those training experiences and say, oh, this is because of this. Yeah, I do feel aches and pains. But at the same time, man, I've gained so much experience. And the experience I gained over the last 20 years training have given me the ability to coach other people, even those on a much higher level than myself. I've brought people to Olympia. I've had many pros that I've worked with. I've turned people pro. And that was not due to me being the best athlete or best bodybuilder or best competitor. It was due to the fact that I had the knowledge, I had the experience, I had the expertise, and I had the skills. And I will never take any of that stuff back. So if I have some aches and pains, hey, it's all par for the course.
Yeah, absolutely, man. No, I love that. Yeah, the experience, and then like you said, living it, and you've been able to train with people that you've learned a lot from. And yeah, I think that's super important. Real quick, before I want to still ask you another question about I believe that you said, so you're wrapping up your building phase here. Is that because you guys are doing a photo shoot?
Yes.
Okay.
We do have the intention. I just cannot forecast when it will be. And this is due to the fact that I want to do a photo shoot with my partner, my significant other, Jane. And unfortunately, 7 weeks ago, she developed an outbreak of shingles. She's been working herself incredibly difficult. She just takes on too much, to be honest with you. And I am guilty about this because I work incessantly. So I will be completely straight up with you. I'm not a good representative in our household of pulling back. She was taking on a lot of things and she started having some symptomology, and that comes with nerve damage, nerve issues. And she got a outbreak, a rash essentially, and she ended up having shingles. So the last 7 weeks I've pulled her, I had to take her off out of the gym for a full week and then auto-regulate her training every single week because I do coach her. And it's been a very difficult process because this is someone that loves to train. Jane was second in the country a couple of years ago at nationals. So she's a very well-accomplished bikini competitor. She's not interested in that bodybuilding scene anymore, but she's a full-time coach. She's very successful in her own right. And it was very difficult because when I coach her, I have to remove myself from being her partner and her lover, essentially. And I have to treat her just like any client. And she checks in like any client. She has a designated check-in day and a check-in time. And the whole process is the same. I treat her just like I would any other client, but with compassion, with empathy, just like I would anyone else. But that has shifted back our plans because ideally we would have done it together, this whole process, but I cannot push her into this phase until she's ready. Luckily, the last few weeks, her biofeedback has come back much better. We've been able to run labs. Things are looking much better. She no longer has any visible symptomology nor visible the actual rash itself from shingles. We're just taking it very 1 week at a time. And
Yeah.
so we're really doing things based off her biofeedback. Luckily, her nutrition is very dialed in. Also, we live together. I'm someone that I'm point at all times. Jeff, you've been out with me on my birthday. I'm still eating mustard salads and stuff. This is who I am. And so she was able to maintain very good body composition, but the timeline in which we will do a photo shoot, because I do want to do it together. I think that's something that it would just be a bonding experience. We want to get images done for, eventually it'll be an engagement shoot, but for now we'll do a ripped photo shoot that will help with promotional material for both our businesses. We're both coaches. She also has another business she's going to be launching called Protein Treat Queen, which is a low calorie, high protein treat that will be delivered nationwide. So we're going to do some material for that, but I'm not going to rush this. And so I may be ready early. I may just hold on, or I may take it a lot slower than I usually would, because to be honest with you, usually within 12 weeks, I'm shredded. And I've done this so many times that I know the process, but I may just slow it down based on her rate of progress and just making sure that she's doing well. And same thing for me. There's been times I've been down under 5% body fat, my friend. I won't say that I'm the most cognitively checked in at those time points, just because low body fat really has implications on all systems, especially cognitively. And so if I have to make sure that I don't go to that depth to make sure that my business is operating on all cylinders and my relationship and everything else, I'm more than willing to sacrifice that, because I've had many looks over the years ranging from 5% to 8%, and they're all in photo shoot shape. They all come out with good images. So it's really about just the experience, embracing the process. And I also like to experiment with things every single time I do a fat loss phase. And so I'm sure that I'll come up. Last year, we had a full in-depth podcast on my high flux fat loss phase, which was published on your podcast channel. And that year, it was me shit testing what I had done with other people in maintenance and what I had done with myself outside of a deficit. And so I decided to do it in a deficit. And so I used a high flex approach, 25,000 steps a day, 2+ hours of cardio a day, and I kept my food very high. This year, it'll probably be a different experiment, but I haven't forecasted that far ahead, especially because I do my check-ins for myself on Sundays. And so I was planning on doing that. And then the pec strain happened on Saturday. And I was like, you know what? Just be where your feet are. This is an expression I tell clients many times. Be where your feet are. In the present moment, you need to worry about rectifying and recovering from this, and then we can move on to the fat loss phase.
That's what I was just going to want. I was just wondering if it was like, hey, because again, I know we talked about this on our last episode in terms of body fat. And so I didn't know if it was like, hey, I'm going into fat loss now because you want to do this photo shoot, or if you're just like, hey, I like to maintain a certain physique and I want to get there. Or do you just like to have a fat loss phase thrown in there to kind of keep things tight overall? So that's more so what I was getting at with the question in terms of if it was around your fat loss phase or what that looked like specifically there. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yes. It's more so that I consider a fat loss phase to be a beneficial part of the yearly periodization process. So it allows me to potentiate my next phases. And I find that by getting leaner, it improves insulin sensitivity. It helps with my gastrointestinal function, because a lot of times when I'm building, I have to eat a lot of calories. And so you start getting bloated and distended. And regardless of how many tricks and tips that you put in there, at certain calorie loads, it just becomes a burden, especially cognitively. I get what's called post-meal somnolence, which is sleepiness. People call it a carb coma. Really, it's actually based on total energy intake, not on carbohydrate content of the meal. That's actually a myth that many people, it's a misconception essentially. And so really, I like getting lean, for many reasons. First, I come from a physique background. I competed 15 times. I've done well over 100 photo shoots. I used to do professional modeling. So it is something that I am maybe more, I lean towards it first and foremost. Secondarily, I like to experiment with things. I do believe from a coaching perspective, and I will always believe this, that I need to do what I have other clients do. And I've never asked someone to do what I have not done. So if I'm going to continue to evolve my methods, my strategies, my approaches, I need to continually test things on myself. So I will not do, and I'm very specifically doing a fat loss phase because I want to test different peaking methods, because I have a lot of clients that are going to be doing photo shoot preps. So photo shoots themselves or contest preps in the fall. And so there are certain things I want to experiment with, despite the fact that I've tested these things, different types of strategies, dozens of times on myself and on other people. And so I'm continually learning. And I really think that the best way to learn is not only to dig into the literature and the best available knowledge that we have from the body of evidence, but to really test it on ourselves. I'm someone that's very objective. I'm very analytical. I'm very data driven. I take comprehensive notes on everything that I do. And so I'm able to really gauge my response, knowing that everything else is held constant. All right, I'm going to try this type of, last year it was protein hyperfeeds, where I went up to 4.4 grams per kilogram on certain days. And I used those almost as like my version of a refeed. Now, I'd gotten that theory from Alan Aragon 10 plus years ago, but I never used it in a fat loss phase in that context. So I utilized that strategy. And there were so many things that I tested, and some of them were advantageous. And as with all things, this is the Bruce Lee mentality. You take what's useful and discard what's useless. And by continuing to experiment, and also I'll do other consultations with other professionals that I respect, I'm able to continually evolve and refine and sharpen my skill set.
Yeah, I love that, man. Yeah, you're always testing it on yourself there. But the other reason I bring it up too is I do feel like no matter what, like it's probably a good idea for people to get into a deficit at some point in time throughout the year. Or again, I think you can obviously widen that time frame based on somebody's body composition, overall stress load, their dieting history, and everything like that. But I do feel like even if you don't necessarily want to get like super shredded, I just feel like from a physiological standpoint and overall health, and if we're looking at, like you said, insulin sensitivity, metabolic health, like to me, it makes sense to get into a deficit at some point in time throughout the year, or again, maybe slightly longer time frames, depending on where you're at. Just kind of keep that sharp, right? Kind of hit the catabolic side of things just a little bit more, especially if you're, eating a good amount throughout the year. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something that you feel like people benefit from doing that, or well, yeah?
Absolutely. I think that is a component of every nutritional periodization plan that I put together. There is some dedicated period towards fat loss, and that has benefits from a physique perspective, from an insulin sensitivity perspective. I know that many years ago we talked about P ratios, and a lot of people have debates about these things. But regardless of whether you want to debate whether being leaner predisposes you towards more muscle gain, what it does do is gives you longer runway for productive muscle gain, meaning that if you get leaner, you're able to actually see the fruits of your labor from a lean gaining perspective much better than if you were to just say hold a higher body fat percentage and just keep pushing from there. And then also from a motivation aspect, I work with real people in the real world. It doesn't matter what a study on a sumo wrestler showed that they can gain more lean mass or fat-free mass than any other athlete in the world. None of them want to be 300 pounds and 40% body fat. So when it comes down to the physique perspective, there has to be some internal motivation. And for many people, including myself, I'm no better than this. There are internal reasons as to why I want to look a certain way. I consider my physique somewhat of a representative of the knowledge I have, and then also the lifestyle and discipline that I've lived and I've really implemented into my daily routines. And I think that every year, this is an opportunity for me to test myself. And I do think that it's conducive both physically and mentally for people. And I will say that many times what I'm also doing is when someone has been, and like myself, been an extended building period, by the time I get done with this, it'll be 28 or 29 weeks of building. So we're talking 7 months. But even so, with clients, thinking of a very specific client right now, Patty, which I've had an extended building phase for a long period of time, or I have another client, Hillary, which is in a photo shoot prep right now. It's her first photo shoot prep. And we did 48 weeks of building. And then I've transitioned her into that. Not only do I think it's conducive because there's only so much muscle growth sensitivity you have, essentially, or runway that you can have while still feeling comfortable, while still maintaining good insulin sensitivity, while still maintaining good gastrointestinal function. But how are we going to really know how much you gained if we don't get you down again, if we don't reveal the lean mass that's gained? And then also throughout that process, when I get someone lean, including myself, I'm always able to reanalyze that person's physique and say, all right, during the building phase, it really looked like this person had really good delts. They were full, they were round. You know what? By the time we got down to fat loss, that rear delt wasn't as muscular. There was some fat padding there, and it was really conflating what I was seeing from an analytical physique analysis perspective. And I think I look at things, I'm very big on photo analysis, and that comes from bodybuilding. I started coaching people where I literally used to have them pose in front of me, like 6 feet in front of me. So it was a visual analysis. There was many times that, and there's been many times over the years where the scale is not even included in my coaching. And that's not because it's not a good data metric or a metric to track things. It's just because the person I'm working with, A, doesn't have a good relationship with the scale, but B, they don't care about body weight. They care about body composition. And so I do think that going through cyclical phases of building up and building lean tissue and focusing on that and really fueling muscle growth and getting your intake much higher than it has been previously, building that metabolic capacity and that resilience, I think that's great. And we build flexibility within those times. But I do think that there's other times where it's good to push the other pedal essentially and really push the gas pedal towards fat loss, push yourself, see what you're made of, both mentally, physically, and then reveal the gains that you've made previously so that we know, hey, the next time we go into lean building phase, either we took it too far because it took you way too long to get lean, or B, hey, you know what? A lot of these muscle groups were not actually as muscular as we thought they were. We were overestimating, over-indexing on this. So we may have to extend this out, or what I do personally is I run specialization cycles with people. And that's really, that analysis at the end of the fat loss phase is as integral as that first analysis that I make when someone comes to me as a client, and I do a needs analysis is what I call it. And I look at their whole physique, what I think are weaknesses and strengths, what are things we need to focus on, what are bottlenecks in their physiology, but also bottlenecks in their physique.
Yeah. And no, obviously someone that is, again, from a body composition standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. I would be curious, maybe I should ask it this way in terms of if maybe someone, obviously I think at the end of the day, everybody is somewhat body comp focused no matter what, right? But let's say maybe they aren't overly concerned about body composition. Do you still see some benefit to that person still running a deficit it every so often in that situation, even if they're not overly physique focused, right? And I'm assuming probably just to keep body fat levels within kind of that range that we've kind of talked about in the past as well too. Maybe that's a better way to ask it.
Yeah, I do think it's conducive if they are going past a threshold where they're now. I have to give a caveat here. I don't work with anyone that's not body composition focused.
Yeah.
So I'm speculating essentially.
Yeah.
I've had certain cases where people are like, listen, I've gotten to where I want to be. I want to maintain really. And then we slow gain essentially, or I'll do a main gaming phase with them and we're eating at maintenance. But if someone was just treading up because they're essentially at theoretical maintenance, but their weekend splurges or the bicyclists and taste have added up and they're starting to gain more body fat than is conducive for their body composition, but also for their metabolic health. I start seeing lab work starts skewing. Fat loss is going to be the most conducive lever to pull in that state. So I do think at some point for most people, and I'm saying the majority of people, at least that I work with, we're going to do some type of dedicated fat loss phase. But even if it was in a different context, it doesn't mean you have to run a full fat loss phase. You could still do a cleanup phase. You could still do a mini cut. We did
Short
many
one.
years ago, we did a huge deep dive into mini cut. So you guys can look back onto Jeff's channel about that. There are many reasons as to why you would do that. Just in my case, I'm so focused on body composition focused individuals, and they're all just very physique development focused that it is something that I'm going to include with every phase that I do or every periodization program that I do.
Yep, makes sense. Like I said, I just see a lot of benefit, like you said, kind of hitting more the anabolic side of the gas pedal, but then at certain periods of time, definitely pushing the catabolic side of things, breaking down side of things a little bit more. I think it's beneficial to do that. But obviously, I feel like if somebody is going to want to do those types of things, they're going to be body comp focused most anyways, right? So it's just going to be a part of the process.
Absolutely.
Cool, man. You ready to dive into the questions?
Yep. I'm going to hit you with the first one, my friend. So the first question is, does cardio after lifting prevent muscle growth?
Yeah, I think this is a good question because I know I've been a little bit more, like I said, really enjoying the cardio side of things. So I think we can take this a couple ways. One, does it prevent muscle growth? No, I don't think it prevents it by any means, right? Does it impact it? Maybe. And I think that's where it depends on the context and the setup. So maybe that's kind of where I'm going to take it. I think the interference effect is definitely something that I used to be way more worried about, right? To the point where I was like, I don't want to do any cardio. It's going to mess up all my gains. And I think that's a little bit too far on that side. But I do think that obviously, depending on what you do, I do think it can start to impact things there, but definitely not preventing it for sure. I guess some things to look at on this to lower that would be, I think, try and separate them if you can. If it's feasible within your schedule, definitely try and do that. I think the more you can separate them, it's probably going to be a little bit better to be able to do that, right? I think intensity and load management is key to this, right? What does that look like? What's your intensity in that cardio afterwards? Load management being like, what are you doing overall? What's your overall volume that you're doing, right? I think the more that you do overall, the more you're definitely going to have to be on top of other things. And I think the more it can start to impact your muscle growth in that process. I wouldn't pair this with a lower calorie day. So if you're someone that has some days where you like to cycle calories, or maybe you're in a fat loss phase or something like that, I would definitely be careful with that. I think the lower your overall energy gets, I think it can start to impact things a little bit more. I think your amount of muscle that you have and your leanness that you're at also matters as well too in this. I think, again, the more muscle you have, the leaner you are. I think it could potentially start to impact things more than if you're a little bit less muscle, a little bit more body fat in those situations. But I think the intensity aspect of it is key. I don't know if I would necessarily go and just do a 3-hour run or that's super intense right after that. I guess some other things that you could potentially do to lower the impact on that is obviously your overall recovery, making sure that sleep's in check. Again, overall stress load is in check from a nutrition perspective. You're well fueled, you're feeling around these set if you're going to do them back to back. I think you could potentially do some intra carbs if you're going over that kind of 60 to 90 minute mark in terms of both sessions together. I think you could potentially benefit from some carbohydrates within that to maybe help with that. But I definitely would make sure I get some nutrition around this if I'm going to do it to limit that there. And I think if you have those things in check, I think the impact on it is going to be very small, but also really consider what is your goal as well too, right? Are you more muscle growth focused, or are you more trying to build your cardiovascular fitness? Because I think that's important too. But again, that's where I come back to trying to separate them if you can. But if you can't, I'm less concerned about this than I was, say, a couple of years ago, as long as we have these other variables in check.
Yeah, so I agree with you. If I was to give a short answer, which I never do, but if I was to give a short answer, I would say no. Cardio after lifting does not prevent muscle growth, at least in any significant way that we could see for the vast majority of trainees. What I do want to do is I want to expand upon you mentioned the interference effect, and that's essentially that the competing molecular signals from resistance training and cardio have an interference effect with one another, where the theory was that cardio would blunt the hypertrophic response to resistance training. And that was where the whole concept of cardio kills your gains came. And I really want to press down upon this because this is something I've looked into in great detail. And I really believe that this is a great example of how a single piece of research gets oversimplified and then becomes a narrative moving forward. So the interference effect was first identified back in 1980 by Hickson. And if you actually look at the setup, there's a strength training group and there's a concurrent training group. And the concurrent training group is doing both resistance training and cardio. Now, here's the issue. Many people don't actually read the study. So they were doing that concurrent training group was doing 5 days a week of heavy resistance training and a lot of lower body training. That was the same session. That was the same setup as the strength training group. However, they were also doing 6 days a week of intense interval running and all out running protocols. Some of these running protocols were 45 minutes of as long as you can go or as fast as you can go. So we're comparing, when we look at the actual study, we were comparing 5 workouts a week versus 11 intense workouts per week. And in that group, strength gains, so in the concurrent training group, strength gains went up for the first 7 weeks, I believe, but then they reduced in the last 2 weeks compared to the strength training only group. So that is a study where this entire interference effect comes from. And what people don't realize is that the design of the study isn't anywhere near what most people are doing. A normal trainee isn't doing that. Most of the times, if you actually look at a comparative analysis, what they were doing in the Hickson trial is double the amount of intense aerobic work that anyone would do in a normal training program, especially someone working with you or myself, where we're going to program cardio as a 1B essentially. So it's going to be in the context that we're taking into consideration what that person is doing from a resistance training perspective. Now, the issue with this study and how far it's been taken out is that the entire intention was actually to show an interference effect. They didn't have that terminology yet, but the aerobic protocol was specifically designed to maximize fatigue and show this effect. And if I remember correctly, I believe the concurrent training group actually lost body fat during this process. So they, by proxy, that would mean that they were in a deficit, which could have confounded the results. But then when we look at more recent research, and this is something I did a massive deep dive in a few years ago for the Chasing Clarity podcast, there's the most recent meta-analysis that I'm familiar with is the Schumann meta-analysis. And they looked at, I want to say 43 trials. And what they found was that concurrent training, so meaning doing both resistance training and cardio, does not compromise muscle hypertrophy or strength development. The only thing that could be affected and slightly affected at that is explosive strength. And other studies show peak power, essentially. And even that effect is reduced or eliminated when the resistance training and cardio sessions are separated by 3 hours or more. So from a coaching perspective, I really like to look at cardio from this perspective. Ideally, I would suggest, and this is what I do suggest to clients, separating your cardio and resistance training sessions apart. I personally do fasted cardio in the morning, and then 3 or more hours later, I train. However, based on the question and how it was composed, I'm assuming that person needs to do them in the same session. So if that's the case, train whatever is your priority first. If you're trying to build muscle, your resistance training needs to be done first because that's the main driver of the adaptation that you're looking for. So you should do that first and then do cardio after so that it doesn't interfere your lifting performances. We also have research. If you actually look at the meta-analysis on this and then the reviews, a lot of the suggestions within the narrative reviews themselves is that if muscle growth is your priority, do resistance training first and then do cardio after it. That way that your lifting is done in a fresh state, and then any fatigue that you do happen from the cardio or happen to get from the cardio occurs once the work that matters for your physical is already done. Then the other thing we have to consider is cardio modality. If you just train legs and then you go run for 45 minutes like they did in that Hickson trial, you're stacking additional fatigue onto a muscle group that's already trying to recover and adapt. So I'd recommend that. So I would recommend if you're going to do post-workout cardio, and this is what I do with clients, I tell them do an incline treadmill, ride the bike, or another form of low impact steady state cardio. I really like the elliptical for this because it's so low impact. And then for those that are prioritizing their physique development, I generally recommend lower impact modalities for the bulk of their cardio work because cardio duration and intensity matter. It's much different to do, say, 20 to 40 minutes of low intensity walking after a resistance training session than, like you alluded to do a 3-hour session. So you're essentially stacking marathon training on top of resistance training. And the further you push cardio volume and intensity into that endurance athlete spectrum, the more you start competing for resources that could be going towards muscle growth. So I really think that as long as you are intelligent about how you sequence things between your resistance training and your cardio, you pick lower intensity modalities and you aren't doing a ton of cardio, I don't think it's going to undermine your muscle growth at all. And honestly, we do have some studies, and now they're not of the best quality, but there is a study out of Stu Phillips' lab where they do a unilateral design where they train one leg through cardio and then do resistance training versus one leg that didn't. And they actually saw greater gains in that one leg. Now, it's confounded because it's a new trainees, but what I really try to get across is for most people, this is a nothing burger, meaning you don't have to worry about it.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's definitely overblown for sure. And I think again, how you're setting it up is ultimately the most important thing. And I agree with you. Definitely doing it lower impact stuff for sure. And I found it to be, if I am gonna do it, try maybe again, this is less important, but kind of like you alluded to there, potentially pair it with upper body. Obviously, again, if upper body is for you, maybe you slightly reconsider that. But again, if you're doing it afterwards, I think the impact's going to be minimal there. Definitely not going to prevent it. Could it impact it potentially if we start to stack up too many things that not in our favor in terms of nutrition and load management and intensity and everything like that. So
Absolutely. All right, on to question two, which I'll take off first. So the
yeah.
question is, what are the most common dieting mistakes holding people back from achieving a lean physique? So I really like this question. Honestly, I think that this could be an episode in and of itself. So we may have to do this at some point, Jeff,
Yeah.
but I'll go through just a few. So the
Yeah.
first mistake is focusing only on calorie intake without considering food quality. Now, before I dig into this, I want to be clear, calories are still the primary driver of body weight. So if you're trying to lose fat, you need to be in a calorie deficit. So you cannot eat in a surplus of high quality foods and lose fat. But the issue with the calories only thinking that is that it ignores everything else that determines whether you can actually sustain a deficit. And that's highly driven by your food quality. And we have research that reinforces this. So if we look at one of the best studies that I always think of when I think about this topic of food quality and food processing, low quality versus high quality, is a metabolic ward study that was by Kevin Hall. And essentially what they did was they put individuals into an ultra processed diet for 2 weeks and then a whole foods diet for 2 weeks. Now, during the 2 week ultra processed diet, those individuals ate more than 500 calories more per day and gained over 2 pounds of fat. Whereas when those same individuals were put on the whole foods diet, they ate less and lost body fat. Now, in both conditions, they ate to fullness. So it wasn't like they were trying to overeat in the ultra processed condition and then they were trying to undereat in the whole foods condition. The foods that made up their diet just happened to be higher energy density and lower satiety per calorie. So they ended up over consuming without meaning to. So when I tell my clients to focus on food quality, I'm not telling them that calories don't matter. What I'm really trying to get across to them is that food quality is what makes the calorie target they need to hit to lose fat more sustainable. So when we look at food quality, that's generally going to include foods that contain a higher protein content, a higher fiber content, and they're also lower energy density. So it makes it easier to sustain a deficit without feeling like you're starving. And so, really, when it comes down to it, I think food quality is something that many people overlook. They think about calories just from a myopic perspective. They're like, oh, I can comprise my macros by anything as long as I'm in a deficit. Yes, for one day that works. Over the long term, a lot of times that's going to hinder your ability to actually sustain a deficit and actually not only sustain a deficit, but sustain an effective one. The second mistake is the eating healthy but not tracking trap. I see this a lot, is one of the most common patterns I see. I will often do consultations or I will have someone that comes in for a coaching intake and they tell me that they've been eating super clean for months and they're not losing weight and they can't understand why. And what almost always happens is they're equating the healthiness of a food with it being good for fat loss. And they are not one and the same. Some of the most nutritionally dense foods that we have are also the most energy dense. So, really, there's been a lot of times that I've done nutritional analyses or nutrition audits on these individuals, and they're eating very healthy foods, quote unquote. So we're talking about their diets filled with avocado or nuts or nut butter, salmon, full fat Greek yogurt, granola, dried fruit. These are all foods that we'd consider healthy, but all of them can rack up calories quickly if you're not paying attention to them. So a great example of this is 2 tablespoons of olive oil contains 240 calories and 2 tablespoons of Skippy peanut butter contains 200 calories. But these servings are so small that it's easy to either overpour, especially if you're not tracking, or what I really see is a lot of people think what they think is a serving of peanut butter is actually something that contains 300 plus calories. So in these individuals, they're not overeating junk food, they're overeating healthy food, and there's just no awareness of their intake. And we can't course correct it because they're not measuring anything. So they just think that as long as they're eating healthy, that they should be losing body fat. The next one is people that are tracking, but they're not tracking accurately. And this is where I find it to be very interesting because we have such a strong body of evidence on showing, looking at tracking and showing that self-reported intake is one of the least reliable forms of data we have. So the one study I always like to touch on because it hits on so many areas that are applicable to the general population and some of the clients avatars that we see coming our way is a study by Lickman and Co. And they took individuals that were self-identified as diet resistant, meaning they claimed they couldn't lose weight eating 1,200 calories per day. Now, when they monitored and measured what these individuals were actually eating, they were found that they were underreporting their calorie intake by 47% and overestimating their calorie burn from exercise by 51%. So when we stack those errors together between the energy intake mistakes and the energy expenditure mistakes, that was well over 1,300 calories per day that they were not accounting for. So that's not a small difference. That's the difference between weight loss and precipitous weight gain. There's also a study by Champagne and colleagues that looked at the dietary habits, and then also the dietary tracking accuracy of registered dietitians. And so these are people that are like Jeff and myself. They're professionally trained in nutrition, yet the dietitians underreported their calorie intake by 223 calories, I believe, and then the non-dietitians underreported by 429 calories. And I'm not saying that this is a willpower issue or that people are intentionally dishonest. These errors are human nature, and the more we understand them, the more we can build systems around them that account for them. Now, another thing that I see within this handful of tracking errors is what I call the BLTs problem. So that's bites, licks, and tastes. These are things like, oftentimes I'll have conversations with clients and it's, what do you do when you're cooking dinner? It's like, oh, I had a handful of nuts, or they have a bite of their kids' pasta or chicken nuggets. You start tasting the sauce when you're cooking. Or a big thing is the cream in someone's coffee, the cream in the milk. All these things are forgotten to log. Or like the dressing or condiments or sauces that are put on restaurant menus. None of these get tracked, but they add up. And 200 calories of untracked BLTs per day over a 30-day month is 6,000 calories. So that's almost 2 pounds of fat gained from things you didn't write down. So there's so many things that are implicated in why people make mistakes from a dietary habits perspective that inhibits fat loss that they're just not accounting for. And really, when it comes down to it, there's many people that have come to me and told me they had weight loss resistance or they had a metabolic issue. And what I'm almost always looking for before I dive deep into, obviously I can do blood work analysis and I'm well versed in blood work, but oftentimes I'll say 9 out of 10 times, what I'm going to first is actually looking at the gap between what they think they're eating and what they're actually eating. And the fix is not to white knuckle your willpower or to really try to find an issue that isn't there. It's really to build awareness through a period of accurate tracking so you can recalibrate and really readjust from there. And also, I found that when I'm able to have these conversations, and it's not from a judgmental perspective, but I tell someone, listen, we are going to comprehensively and precisely track everything you're eating for the next some odd dates, 7 days. I just did this with a client of mine today. Next 7 days, I want you to track every single thing that goes into your mouth, and gum, condiments, sauces, BLTs, all these things. It seems very invasive at first, and it seems overcomplicated and time consuming, but I can't tell you how many times that I've gotten that email back or that voice note back from a client. They've said, wow, I had no idea I was eating this much. And it's almost like a sigh of relief that they feel because they realize, hey, this isn't a metabolic issue. This isn't something that I'm going to need hormones or this, that, and the other. This is something that is within my control. I just have to be more diligent and more aware of my habits.
Yeah, reframing it as that, right? Like you said. And plus, I just think in today's modern environment, it just makes it so easy to overlook these things, right? And then you add stress into the equation. And again, you can be a bit more reactive and it's holy crap. And so it's a lot of it's awareness too, right? Hey, I'm not trying to call you out. I'm just, hey, this is just a matter of fact of it, right? And I like using those studies too. I think that can be super helpful. And plus off of that too, like when we talk about the modern environment with some of those things starting to add up, what's even crazier about it too is when you are in a deficit for whether it be even short term, or again, if you actually are in a deficit for extended periods of time when you're dropping body fat, your brain's going to subconsciously push you to move less and to consume more food, right? So you just naturally drift towards that maintenance and surplus in that situation, right? And I always try to frame that to people as well too, if they feel like they're getting stuck, like your body's just going to subconsciously just naturally drift you back to that point. So a couple things that you said, and then I have a couple I want to add to it. The eating healthy one too, right? I hear that all the time. I'm eating healthy. What's going on? And it's like, also, what is eating healthy too? I think that's just such a vague term. It's like diving into a little bit more, like what does that mean? Because it can mean something different from one person to the next, right? Because food marketing can make you feel like something is potentially healthy too, right? Like I don't want to pick on this specifically, but like gluten-free, it's okay, that's good, it's gluten-free, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like you have to your total intake, like it doesn't make it automatically healthy.
We could take it even one step further. We can actually really hyper focus on fitness foods. So that could be things, generally fitness foods are going to be things that are marketed towards a fitness enthusiast demographic. So that is protein bars, that is low carb tortillas, low net carb products. If you really look at those, the energy intake or the energy content of those products never match the actual labeling. And that's due to the FDA loopholes and the ability for them to subtract both fiber and sugar alcohols. But just because they're subtracting it from the label doesn't mean that your body doesn't physiologically absorb those calories. So a great example I always give, I came from the supplement industry. And so in 2013, we first acquired the ability to distribute Quests. So Quest bars were huge at that point. And really the only place you could get them before I was distributing them through a large distributor that I worked for was at like GNC. They weren't in Walmart. They weren't as commercially available. This is 13 years ago. And so I remember during one of my preps, I thought that it was an isocaloric swap, essentially. Oh, this is 180 calories. It's 20 grams of protein. All right, I can stack this onto a meal if I'm short on protein, or if I can make up, usually most of my meals are 50 grams of protein. So I can do 30 grams from a high quality whey protein, and then I can do 20 grams from this. And this will make up my fat and a little bit of my carb content, because at that time they were advertising the net carb content was four grams. So when you look at most Quest bars, they'll market themselves as 180 calories, and they generally have 20 to 21 grams of protein. They have 4 grams of net carbs is like the lowest one that they have. And then usually 7 to 8 grams of fat, somewhere in that region, 6 to 8 grams of fat. If you really do the math on that, and I remember doing this very specifically because this was something that was impacting my own progress because I was eating them daily, but then also in the subsequent years, it happened with a lot of clients. A Quest bar markets itself as having 180 calories when in actuality, it usually has 250 or more. Now, say that you're doing that every single day, 70 calories times 7, that's 490 calories. All right, over the course of a month, that's stacking up to 2,000 calories. So now you're losing 2/3 of a pound less per month. These things compound on top of themselves. And oftentimes we don't realize because in your mind you said, oh, that's a healthy protein bar. This is made for fitness people. Marketing is very deceptive. And so a lot of people, they misattribute certain qualities to certain products. And I'm not saying that if you're stuck at an airport, you have no other item that you can get to. And the protein bar might be your best item, best option possible. But if you're incorporating them on a daily basis, especially things like those low carb tortillas that destroy people's guts first and foremost, but they have way more calories than they're actually marketing. A lot of these things are inaccuracies that you think you're making the better choice, but the better choice would have just been to have a whole food meal.
Yeah, absolutely. Even oh, hey, it doesn't have many ingredients, or it has real ingredients or whatever too, right? So diving into that, like I've always found that to be useful to dive into. Okay, cool. That's great. You eat healthy, but let's dive into that a bit more. And like you said, getting food logs and et cetera can really help. And then really teaching them like, it's overall what you do. It's not like one choice in isolation that is going to be the big thing there. And just because something's marketed towards something doesn't necessarily make it a better choice there. So a big one too, and this is like hey, sometimes I'll see this as, oh, hey, 85%, I'm eating good food 85% of the time. I'm tracking 85% of the time. And I always tell people that's good. That last 10 to 15% of what you're either not logging or whatever it is, like that can make a huge difference, right? If those are foods that you're not logging, those are probably more calorically dense foods. If you also stat on top of that, I just feel like that last 10 to 15% of what you're not logging, or maybe that isn't healthy or whatever it may be, like that could really start to add up, right? So it's just because you're doing 85%, it's not like all right, you got most of it covered, you're good to go. It's no, that last little bit could really add up to where it's enough to where it's your maintenance or a surplus, depending on what you do with that, right? I think in a fat loss phase, I always tell people this, it's relentless. You have to do it day in and day out. And unfortunately, 85% of the time isn't going to cut it for everybody with that. I think another thing too is not being able to withstand the diet fatigue potentially, right? When I say diet fatigue, I'm just lumping some of that stuff in there, like hunger. I think if you don't handle any hunger, or you feel like anytime you're hungry, you got to eat, I think that's going to cause you to potentially not get that lean physique that you want, right? Because if we're talking lean, as you get leaner, you're going to have more downsides, more diet fatigue start to show up. Now, again, we can do things to help manage that and everything like that, but those things will start to creep up a little bit more. And so I think you need to be able to withstand some of that stuff as you get deeper and deeper into a deficit. If we're talking achieving that lean physique and kind of getting to leaner points than what you've done in the past. I think poor meal timing is another thing that we would want to potentially look at there, right? Could we set up our meal timing a little bit better? Again, calories are going to be king, as you talked about, and diet quality is super important. But I feel like if we do screw up our meal timing, that can definitely make things a bit more challenging to stick with it, right? Because the biggest thing for me, I've noticed that in fat loss phases, if I go those periods of time where I go a little bit longer without eating, or again, I don't have a great plan for one day, and those usually fall on the weekends because my routine's a little bit different. I just you get more hungry, and it's just a lot harder to manage these things, right? When you get to that point. I think meal timing is a big thing. And then the last thing I'll say here is staying in fat loss too long. I think if you push it too long and you don't ever throw in any sort of break from fat loss dieting and like a planned break, or like a good maintenance period of time or surplus, whatever it is for you, I think it's going to be harder to really achieve that lean physique that you're going to if you just keep trying to push all the way through there.
Absolutely. All right, Jeff, we're going to go on to question number 3. So is it possible to maintain muscle once it's built, but progressive overload is no longer there? So once the muscle has been built, can you maintain it if you don't have progressive overload in place?
Yep. So basically, yeah, is it possible to maintain muscle there? And so I think 100%, I think it's definitely possible to maintain muscle once muscle's built without the progressive overload being in there, because it's definitely easier to maintain muscle than it is to build it, for sure, right? I think the maintaining side of things becomes much easier once you've already built it than it is building new muscle. Do you necessarily need progressive overload? I don't think so. I would just wonder like why you wouldn't be still trying to get some progressive overload, because I do think there is more to muscle than just the aesthetic side of things. I would be careful with just not focusing on progressive overload in that process. And I do think that eventually, if you're not trying to get stronger or add more weight or add more reps over time, one, your training is probably going to get super boring. And then two, your training is going to get so easy over time that it's like, what are you doing? So I feel like you're going to naturally progress. Brandon, I know you had to step away for a second, but basically with this, I was saying, yeah, it's easier to maintain muscle than it is to build. So you can get away without providing progressive overload. But I'm also was saying there's more to muscle than just the aesthetic side of things. Like, I think you should still try and build a little bit more muscle because it is a tough tissue to build, right? And you need to go out of your way. I would just caution on not doing that. And then I just think your training's going to get too easy over time, then it's going to be boring anyways, right? If you're never overloading and you do the same thing, your training is just going to get super easy there with that. So that's kind of how I took that question. Did you take that in any other way there?
Yeah, I do see it in the perspective that you're coming from, but really when it comes down to it, I do want to acknowledge that you can maintain muscle that's been built without continuing to drive the same level of progressive overload that you used to build it. And also, the same thing can be said about volume because the volume required to maintain muscle is significantly lower than what it took to put on. But I really want to provide maybe a more useful perspective because I think that there's a better way to look at this than just saying, yes, you could train without progression. Really building muscle requires sustained mechanical tension that's progressive over time because your body, you essentially have to give your body a reason to keep it, to essentially add tissue and then keep it. Obviously, maintaining muscle is a little bit different of a process than the muscle growth itself, and maintenance just requires enough of a stimulus to tell the body that it needs to keep that tissue. Now, when we look at the maintenance research, we actually don't have maintenance research that doesn't implement progressive overload. We do have maintenance research that finds that muscle can be maintained on roughly 1/3 of the volume that it was built in, at least in college age males, because if you actually look at that trial, in the older adults, they were not able to maintain that volume on that low of volume. However, say that you built your physique with, let's say 20 sets per muscle group. You can maintain it in somewhere in the range of 7 to 8 sets per muscle group per week. But here's the key, and this is where most people go wrong. The volume can drop, but the intensity has to stay high. All these trials are looking at either close to failure or at failure. And so your relative intensity, meaning how close those working sets are to failure, needs to stay close to where it was during your building period. So you can drop from, say, 20 sets to 7 sets per muscle per week, but those 7 sets still need to be hard sets because your body doesn't know that it's trying to maintain. It responds to the mechanical tension stimulus. So if you're training, now think about it logically. If you were to go into a type of training cycle where you're not trying to add progressions, by each week, you're going to get further and further away from that proximity to failure. And so you may start to lose tissue because your training is becoming less intense. Now, here's another piece I want to hit on. When I'm working with clients in a phase that usually anytime that I'm working with a client that they're trying to maintain, it's because life is hectic. So they want to maintain muscle rather than grow it. I'm still telling them to aim for progressive overload. But what I'm trying to do is have them keep aiming for it, but at a reduced volume. And the fact is, at a lower volume, progressive overload is actually more feasible than it was when you were training at higher volumes. Because think about it like this. If you were training 20 sets per muscle per week, every set is accumulating fatigue. So pushing to add, whether it be a rep or an increase in load, is harder because you're working through accumulated fatigue. Now, when you drop to a substantially less volume to maintain your tissue and you're training at, say, 7 or 8 sets per week, each one of those sets is being performed in a much fresher state. So hitting personal bests on the lifts that you've been training is not only more accessible, it's easier to do. So really, I want my clients in the mindset that even during a maintenance period, I want them to keep their effort high while training with lower volumes. And if they can still add a rep or a small amount of weight over time, they should. So that continued focus on performance progression is what guarantees that the tissue built is actually being protected, even if the volume is significantly lower than it was. So I would actually shift this individual from looking at it from, hey, I can do the same volume and just have less progressive overload to maintain, and actually invert it and say, I want your intensity high. I want you aiming for progressive overload, but we could substantially reduce your volume and your time in the gym.
And sometimes when you do that too, like you almost, for some people, that actually helps them. It can potentiate some muscle growth, right? Because their quality goes up, right? That's not always the case. It just depends on the person, but you could frame it that way too, where you actually may see things improve because your quality goes up, like you said, because you're not doing as much. But like you said, your intensity definitely needs to go up then if your volume goes down. I think muscle size probably is important to this too, right? Where it's the more muscle you have, it's like you probably have a little less wiggle room there with that, I think, unfortunately. And then I think the time frame aspect of it's important. If this is like a short-term thing, it's probably not a big deal, but obviously the longer you go, kind of like you were saying, it's like you eventually get further and further away from proximity to failure. And that's where I think it can start to add up. I also took this as, I wonder if this person was also thinking like, hey, if I'm like if I'm not able to progressively overload, am I like still maintaining muscle if it's built? Maybe that's another way to look at it too, which if that's the case, then I would look at, are you in a deficit? Maybe you are under recovered. And in that case, you definitely would want to look at those things for sure. And it's definitely going to be harder, I think, to progress in a deficit depending on the size of it and stuff. But we still want to try and aim for, I don't think your training should completely go into the shitter during a deficit. So definitely something I'd want to look at there. But yeah.
Absolutely. All right. You ready for the next one, my friend?
Let's do it, man.
All right, I'll take this one. So this is question 4, and it's, I'm in a group coaching program where we switch programs every 4 to 6 weeks. Do you think this is the best way to program? So I think this is a great question, and I want to give an extensive answer to this because the approach you're describing is incredibly common, especially in group coaching programs. And honestly, I think it's one of the biggest reasons that people who train consistently still struggle to see significant change in their physique year after year when they're in these coaching programs. Now, let me start with explaining what's happening from a programming standpoint, and then I'll explain the physiology under it. Because once you understand the physiology behind muscle growth, I think this issue becomes a lot more obvious. And I personally get questions all the time from clients that are like, hey, I was in a group coaching program previously. Why don't you change programs every 4 weeks or every 6 weeks? It's usually those durations I get asked about most frequently. And from a coaching perspective, the reason is muscle growth is a long-term process that is driven by progressive overload, not by constant exercise variety. Changing programs too frequently is one of the most common mistakes I see, not only in the general public, but also it's a standard practice in many group coaching programs precisely because novelty is good for business retention. Think about it. If you are delivering a group coaching program, you need to keep people engaged, you need to keep them excited, and you have to prevent boredom. So I do understand why programs are built this way. From a business standpoint, novelty sells and clients churn less when the program is constantly new. So every month they have something to look forward to. Now, the issue is that this runs counter to the actual physiology of how the body builds muscle and changes body composition. So I think it's very important for you to understand how resistant or what adaptations occur with the resistant training. So first we have neurological adaptations, and the second is morphological adaptations. Neurological adaptations happen first, and these are improvements in your coordination, your motor unit recruitment, muscle coordination, and even like technical proficiency. How good are you at the skill of the lift itself? Now, when you start a new exercise, most of the gains in the first several weeks are not coming from the addition of new muscle tissue. There hasn't been enough time for you to actually accrete those muscle proteins to actually add to contractile fibers. What they're coming from is from improvements in your nervous system. So your nervous system is learning the movement better. It's getting more proficient at producing force. And this is why people get strong first and get strong faster in a new cycle when they start lifting rather than they get muscular first. And so it's really, muscle is almost a delayed response. And now you'll notice this is if you go into a new training cycle, you'll notice, say you were in a previous training cycle for 6 months, I'm giving a hypothetical, probably the last 4 to 6 weeks, you were slowing down in terms of your rate of progression. Now, if you were to switch all your exercises, you would notice those first 4 to 6 weeks, you're actually gaining quicker than you were at the end of the back cycle of your previous training cycle. And that's because your nervous system is learning how to do the lifts better. Now, that adaptation phase in the literature takes anywhere between 3 to 5 weeks. Some studies show 4 to 6 weeks. The best cited study is 3 to 5 weeks. And it's going to depend on how complex that exercise is. Now, morphological adaptations take longer. And these are the actual structural changes to the muscle tissue. So when we talk morphological adaptations, we're talking increases in muscle size, and that's best measured by increases in cross-sectional area, changes in contractile protein content, and that's the actual hypertrophy, the muscle growth that produces visible improvements in your physique. And these adaptations require sustained training exposure to the same movements and the ability to progressively overload them over time to increase that mechanical tension stimulus. Now, here's the problem with switching programs every 4 to 6 weeks. Now, if neurological adaptations are taking around 4 to 6 weeks and morphological adaptations require sustained overload over the following months, what's happening when you switch programs at the 4 or 6 week mark is that you're getting all neurological gains, and then you switch to new exercises in a new program just as your body is becoming efficient enough to start driving real muscle growth. And this is why I've seen so many lifters who train consistently year after year, but they look the same. And these are the same people that come to me and they say, I want to look like I lift, but they've been lifting for 5 to 10 years and it's what you're doing isn't working. And so a lot of times with these individuals is they're getting better at a variety of exercises. Like they have a Rolodex of exercises that they've gotten better at for a short period of time, but they're not getting any bigger or more muscular as a result. And it's not because they're not training or working hard. It's because the structure is actually preventing the adaptation they're actually after. And I've been doing this for 16 years, man. I've had everyone from gen population clients to IFBB pro athletes. And what I've seen consistently work best are like running 12 to 16 week mesocycles. That time frame is long enough to allow for neurological adaptation to occur. You get mastery of those movements. And then you enter a true progressive overload phase across the same movements for the remaining weeks in that cycle. And that's where tissue actually accumulates. And that's also long enough. I think it's also important to realize that if you are working with a coach and they're not changing your training every 4 to 6 weeks, there's reasons. And it's not only because you're going to get better gains by not doing so, but we need, as coaches, and I'll say this from a personal perspective, I need long enough to gather a lot of training data so I can look at how a client responded across several months of training and then make adjustments based on real biofeedback rather than reacting to short-term fluctuations within a 4 to 6 week window. So I do want to be fair. I understand the group coaching format. I do think variety has its role. I will say personally that I do rotate exercises to work around joint issues. And I'm not saying you need to do the same movement the same way for 10 years. But what I am saying is that the frequency of variety in most group programs is far too high to the timeline of actual hypertrophic adaptation. And really, what I try to get across, I had this conversation quite frequently, and I was happy that I received this one because this is how I really frame it to clients. Novelty may feel exciting, but results come from mastery and execution over time. If the goal is real physique progress, you need to give your body the time it needs to adapt and grow rather than chasing novelty and entertainment. 4 to 6 weeks is just not enough for that timeline. So if you're in a program that's switching that often and you're not seeing the physique progress you want, that's not a coincidence. That's the programming setup preventing you from actually making progress. And it's important to acknowledge that if you've continually run those 4 to 6 week cycles over and over again, and you're no further along from a physique development perspective as you were a year or two ago when you entered those programs, that's the issue.
And then too, again, I agree with you. It's again, when you're doing a group program like that, you have to change it a bit more often so like you all mentioned there, it's like, it all makes sense why, but also at the same time, you don't really know, like maybe there's an exercise that is really good for one person. And it's, if you're constantly switching that up, it's like you could have milked out a ton of more gains there. Maybe somebody needs a little bit more volume for certain muscle groups or certain exercises as well too. And I think you miss out on those things from that perspective. But to really hit on the 4 to 6 week thing, again, I totally agree with you, right? I also wonder too, and this probably comes with it, but how many changes are being made? If it's every 4 to 6 weeks, it's everything's getting changed. And yeah, 100%. I really think that's going to start to impact things, right? But is it a couple exercises? That's a little bit different to me. If it's like, all right, your main exercises are fairly similar, but like you do incline dumbbell curl versus face weight cable curl. Okay, I'm less concerned about that, but still at the end of the day, I still would like somebody to keep something in for a lot longer than that. And then our rep, because then you start getting into our rep ranges changing up a little bit too. And it's like, there's a lot of different things that I'm like, what are the changes there? Is it just a couple? Is it just some rep ranges? What are the things there with that? I agree with you. I think, again, even from a physiological standpoint, you hit on the neural adaptations. But even then, like, I feel like if you keep something in a bit longer, you really learn how to set it up. You really learn how to dial it in terms of the technique that you need for that. Because I think there's generalities of what we want to do for a lift, but I think everyone's body is a little bit different. And so I think adjusting those over time to fit that person is super important. And again, that's hard to do in the first just 4 to 6 weeks if you're just changing. Because like, I feel like once you finally get it dialed in, it's like, all right, now let's do it again. Let's do it again. And then I also think there's certain exercises that maybe that people do maybe for a couple of weeks. And if you're too quick to change them, I don't know about you, but I've had some ones where it's, the first 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, they didn't feel that great. And then all of a sudden just something clicks and it's boom, you just feel really good with that exercise and it ends up becoming a really good one for you there. The other thing I want to hit on too was I also feel like this gets people then with their training of they feel like they're stuck, but they're really not, because why are you stuck? I haven't been able to add weight in 2 weeks. You're not stuck. That's not you being stuck in any form or fashion, right? And so it gets people in this mindset that they feel like they need to progress every single week in their training. And that's not the case, right? Because as you said there, a lot of it's neuro at the beginning. So you're going to see those faster strength increases. But like you said, the magic's in that week 8, 9, 10, 12. And that's when things are a little bit slower and you're not necessarily progressing every single week.
I will say that, and this comes from both a personal coaching experience perspective and then also being at many seminars, I've interacted with other trainers, especially high level trainers, which did a lot of these large scale group coaching programs. And I've been at coaching seminars with them, meaning that they're only speaking to other coaching professionals. And that is a marketing ploy, first and foremost. The other thing that I really have identified in some of these programming setups is that they're almost tricking individuals into thinking they're making progress. Because think about it like this. If neurological adaptations occur in the first 3 to 5 weeks or 4 to 6 weeks, and the program changes within that same time horizon, they're always making progress. They're always seeing increases in these movements. However, these individuals never get to the point where they're really hitting a sticking point or grinding through reps or really pushing to a place where they really have to call upon everything they have in them to make a progression. And so they don't actually they don't actually create or don't actually build that resilience in the gym where they're really getting into the zone. They're really pushing themselves and realizing, hey, on a week to week basis, I can't progress this. A lot of people take that as a negative thing. The only way you get to advance is by seeing your progression slow down. And the only way you can actually get to being advanced in and of itself is to run a program long enough to see how your body responds to it. So I think a lot of times it only almost becomes a maladaptive shortcut or a scapegoat, where then a lot of people, anytime they hit friction within a specific movement or an exercise, they say, I can swap it out. That is not actually getting you to push through that wall. And I think that's an area, this can apply to any aspects of life. Many times the greatest growth comes from embracing and pushing past discomfort. And that's especially applicable in the gym. You will learn your greatest lessons by going to failure. You will learn your greatest lessons by pushing through a movement that was stuck for weeks at a time. And you found a way with good technique and with proper execution to advance it. And I think a lot of times when people get into these cycles where they're so used to everything changing, they're training more from a novelty and entertainment perspective. It feels fun, but there's really nothing, and I'll say this objectively, there is nothing more fun than making progress at something you're truly interested in. So I think that if you guys can stop chasing some of the dopamine secretion that comes with constantly changing things and novelty and things of that sort, and actually really get good at mashing the basics and repeating them over and over again. This is a game of reps. Hypertrophy is a repetitious activity. You need to do it continuously, consistently, and you have to execute over time. That's both from a nutrition, a training, a movement perspective. All these things, they take time doing the same things or very similar things to create an adaptation. That adaptation is what we're actually after. And so I would really encourage those that are in these type of programming or that they're doing themselves and maybe they've been indoctrinated by someone, whether it be a mentor, a coach, a program, an influencer, that they have to constantly change their exercises. I'd really encourage you and implore you to take a step back and think to yourself, all right, you know what? I'm just going to see if I can run something for 12 weeks and see how much further I can be. Because the other issue with this is that oftentimes there's really minimal tracking of progression. It's only within those 4 to 6 weeks periods. And it's not like they come back a year later and they realize, oh, we did the same block again. Because usually it's just like this amalgamation. It's almost like a lottery mix of exercises. If you were to come back a year later, most of those people, if you were to test them on the same exercises, they're no stronger. They really haven't made any adaptations from a strength, a muscle perspective. They're working out, they're not training. And there's a massive difference between the two when it comes to body composition improvement and muscular development.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I guess if I was to play devil's advocate on any of this, it would just be, I think, and I know you're this way too, as a coach, we're always trying to find that happy medium between, hey, I want to push you as long as I can in this phase, but we obviously need to pay attention to a client's, how are they going to be to it? But again, that's where you have that conversation of, are you after more novelty or are you after actual stimulus? Having that conversation with them about that. But I'm always trying to balance that act of pushing clients into their comfort zone. But I do think the client's motivation towards what we're doing from a training perspective is something that is going to allow them to get more out of their training. It is that juggling act, but I agree. If I can get somebody to do like you said, at least 10, 11, 12 plus weeks in a training cycle, like that's where I feel like you're going to see a ton of great progressions there with that.
Absolutely. My friend, you good for one more question?
Yeah, if you are.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. So let's do the one that was the last one on our list, which is, I'll pass this over to you first. What's a belief you changed your mind on in the last few years?
This is actually perfect. This lines up, and it's around deloads. I used to be someone that would do deloads every 4, 5, 6 weeks and change training cycles, right? And I still see some utility to some deloads, but it's definitely on a more auto-regulated approach. And honestly, for a lot of people, I really don't do a full-on deload week anymore. I really like to incorporate a little bit more auto-regulation into their days if they're feeling a little bit under-recovered. Instead of taking full-on deload weeks, say maybe you drop sets for that. Maybe you train a little bit further away from failure on that day. And also just, again, to go back to what we just talked about too, just teaching people with progressive overload, you don't need to add weight or something every single week. Cause I feel like that also leads to people feeling like they need to deload way more often, or like they're feeling super burnt out. And you and I have talked about this. A lot of people don't have an overtraining problem. They have an under recovery problem. And so it's like, that is the big thing that we need to focus on. And that really allows people to be able to push out their training further. And this just goes back to what we just talked about. When you can do that, it's like now you're spending more time in having productive training. Now, again, do I think that if every once in a while you did have a deload week, it would be detrimental? No, because there was that research with Max Coleman. They looked at, I think it was like 9 weeks. They had one group that trained all the way through. One group had a deload in the middle of the week, and there was no difference in terms of hypertrophy. So you could take that two ways, right? You could take it as you don't need a deload, or you could take it as if you do deload, it's not going to do anything. And in that study, they didn't train at all in that week. So it's okay. You're still going to have some people train, right? But I've just kind of gone away from feeling like you need deloads to, I think you can auto-regulate it more and less of a need on a deload in general.
No, honestly, man, this is actually something that I've changed my mind on as well. I will say that years ago, I used to deload clients a lot more frequently, like you're alluding to. And at that time, there was a really strong push in the industry to do. If we think about, there were topics like resensitization that we used to think was essentially influenced by deload frequency. We had the stimulus fatigue ratio, and then we also had the fitness fatigue model, which has been over extrapolated in the resistance training literature. And I remember I went to the first ever live RP Strength Summit. It was like a seminar that was based in Philadelphia. Dr. Mike was actually still a college professor at that time. So this had to be 2018 or 2019. They hadn't blown up yet. And I remember watching a presentation with Dr. Mike Israetel and then Dr. James Hoffman. And there was a massive emphasis on pre-programmed deload. Now, at that time, I remember that their general recommendation was something in the range of every 4 to 6 weeks
Yeah.
of progressive training, you would do a 1 week deload. It was pre-programmed. It was in their templates. I even bought the RP strength templates. And so they were already pre-programmed in there. Now, I'm going to say this. Although that was in vogue, I actually never adopted that. I actually never believed in a rigid pre-planned deload structure. Even then, I guess my approach was more reactive. I would look at biofeedback, I'd look at performance trends, recovery, and then I would implement a deload when it was needed. But over time, and especially as the direct literature has come out, because there's even more research that looks, there was a recent study that just came out a few months ago that looked at deloads, and they're actually seeing less strength gains. Now, mind you, these are in short-term studies, but over the course of months and years, could that
Add
accumulate
up.
into less muscle growth? Potentially. Now, at this point, I really don't view deloads as something that have a say unique physiological benefit, especially in terms of resensitizing hypertrophy. I'm really waiting on the guys from Data Driven Strength. They are doing a study on resensitization. I think that's going to blow the lid off of a lot of things that we thought previously, but it doesn't really make sense. It never has made sense to me conceptually that doing less training would make you able to gain more. When we look, and I went into literature on this, there's an Agasawara, a series of studies where it's like you train 3 weeks, you take 3 weeks off. If you actually look, and I think that this has often been research essentially gets oversimplified sometimes. So if you were to hear the evidence-based perspective, they're like same gains, no significant difference. If you actually look at the plots, the group that continuously trained across those 24 weeks, there's two trials from Agasawara, and they're very similar: 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, somewhere in that fashion, or 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, somewhere in that region. If you actually look at the plots, there's more muscle gain in the continuous groups. It's just not a massive amount of muscle gain, but we're talking about newbies that
Would
are
that
training
add
for
up?
6 months. Yeah, so let's talk about advanced trainees with years of training. Well, they're going through a training period, then a detraining period. I'm sure that it would accumulate into much more substantial effects, especially over the lifetime. And so, really, what I see deloads now as is a tool. But I will say that for my own training, like I just mentioned, I've had one deload in 26 weeks. I generally will go, say, 16 to 20 weeks without deload for the most part. For myself, clients, I might do a little bit less frequently. It's going to depend on the person, but I will tell you that if I was to look at my averages in say just 3 to 5 years ago, I was deloading people probably every 8 to 10 weeks. And for me now, it's listen, I want you to get as much progression as possible, as many progressive, productive weeks. And I utilize a lot of auto regulation strategies. So that even includes I will do undulating RRR targets on certain body parts, whether it's an emphasis or not. So I'll give you an example. I have a one right now that I'm working with. Her upper body is overdeveloped. She was a physique athlete. She's actually an IFBB figure pro, and she wants no physique development in her upper body. So she trains, and I have her train specifically every week at 3 to 4 reps in reserve upper body. But her lower body is what we're doing a specialization cycle. Compound movements are at 1 to 2 reps in reserve, and all her isolations are at taking it to house. It's 0 reps, leave nothing in the fucking tank. And so I will undulate these things, but that also helps from a recovery perspective, an adaptation perspective. So really, the only time that I'm going to implement a deload is if performance has clearly plateaued or regressed for a significant period of time, fatigue is accumulating to the point where recovery is compromised, or there's a psychological need for it. So if someone is going on vacation, or we're trying to manage like aches and niggles, really a lot of times it's more reactive programming, it's more auto regulation. So I'm in full agreement with you. These are things, the whole concepts of deloads and resensitization, these are things that I've really changed my perspective on, especially from a necessity. I think that years ago, there was a lot of, especially people that were put on a pedestal from a scientific perspective. It was really like, all right, you need to accumulate volume, which is another thing I'm not a huge advocate of, especially in these pre-programmed fashions where every week you have to go 1 to 3 sets or whatever it may be. These are things that I just practically haven't seen in the real world. I've tested on myself many times, and sometimes I've run myself into the ground. And then the deload, I find that some people, when I would do it in a more frequent basis, they lost steam. It's almost like they love training and they almost felt worse during the deload. And I was like, man, maybe something's off with this. Is their unique physiology? And then I saw it enough times that I said, no, I'm over indexing on certain biofeedback markers like fatigue or their progress. And it's like they had a shitty week that impaired their performance that week. And I over compensated for it by putting a deload in. I should have just let them go back, have a more productive week because the week prior, they didn't feel it was productive. And so they were disappointed with their training. Then I reduced their training and it's like, this just wasn't conducive.
Yeah. Is it something going on with their recovery, or is it maybe they're progressing a little bit too much? And like you said, you can auto-regulate things a little bit more reactively. Now those, and I feel like that just gives you way more runway to where like now you don't have to have this entire week where you're just like completely backing off training. Because for the short term, yeah, it probably doesn't matter that much, but over a span of a year, it's like, I feel like that definitely starts to add up. I think too, if I did program deloads now, I would do it differently in the sense that I would do less of a like, hey, keep weight the same and it be more maybe a few less reps and maybe less volume essentially, right? You're still doing the same amount of weight, but just like less volume. I think that's a more beneficial way to deload than like now you're going back 10, 15 pounds on something. And then you kind of have to work your way back up as well too, because that was in that study, that was one thing that they did see decrease was the strength at the end of it was a little bit lower, but it wasn't like, because was it the neuro aspect of it or was, who knows what it was, but that was one thing that they
the
did
interesting thing about that is now I would have to go look back into the Coleman study and this brand new study that came out a few months ago. Here's the thing, neurological adaptations, if you actually look at strength development, it generally stays for quite a substantial period of time once you gain it. And so sometimes to me, when 1 week off, I don't know if that'd be enough of a time to actually drop off strength development, because if you think about it like this conceptually, when you look at, and I am very limited in my practical application and expertise in this, so I'm going to make a caveat here. At one point, I used to train strength athletes, so powerlifters. I mostly did the nutrition and I would get into some of the periodization models and stuff, especially when they were going through a hypertrophy block. But a lot of times when they were doing power development and conjugate and stuff, that was someone I would refer out or they would do it themselves. However, I was in those circles and I went to a gym that had a lot of high level powerlifters. If you actually look at the periodization, a lot of times they're essentially undulating up or essentially titrating up into their highest output and highest effort performances a week or 2 weeks prior, depending, it really matters. And so I'm going to speak on more heavyweight and super heavyweights that were also geared lifters. So they were wearing the actual multiply suits. So they would stop lifting, not heavy, they would still lift heavy, but it would be lower volume. They would taper down into the meat itself. And that would usually potentiate their actual strength performance.
Yeah.
So in my mind, strength progression should have stayed stable or even increased after a week off, because now your joint structures, tendons, structural integrity is a little bit enhanced. So I think that it could be that just in totality, they're getting a little bit less muscle, but it's not, because muscle will contribute to force production. So if you're getting a little bit less muscle, you may have less ability to produce force, and that may be interfering with strength progression over a longer term period. And here's the thing with that, the measurement tools that we use for many studies, and as many of these studies specifically, as far as I can remember, it wasn't cross-sectional. Like they weren't doing a CSA or muscle biopsy in a lot of these studies. There are some studies on resensitization where they actually do muscle biopsies because they want to see the phosphorylation of mTOR and different protein kinases essentially. But in these specific studies, I don't know if they're actually looking at the fiber level to really be able to pick up on small changes that could be significant over longer time periods. So just when I think about it conceptually, and I really think like in a critical thinking perspective, I do think over the longer time course, if we were to just think logically, if you are deloading every, say, 4 weeks, and there are 52 weeks in a year, I'm going to divide this up.
That's a lot of time not training.
It's 13 weeks that you're not training productively. And so if we look at 13, let's do the math on that. That's 25% of your
Yeah.
that you're deloading. And so if we were to think about it, if you were easy training for 20, and now I'm using, this is a straw man argument, to be honest.
Yeah.
I'm using the worst argument.
There's so many different ways to deload, and yes. Yep.
100%. If you're doing a very low, you're doing 50% of volume and
weights down,
30% of intensity and everything, you have barely any stimulus, and you do that 13 weeks a year for 25% a year, just from a perspective, I think that may add up not only across the course of a year, but over a time course of a training curve. So this is also something that's remodeled some of my thought processes about this, because it's not that I'm trying to get people to where they want to be in the quickest time possible, because I am someone that looks at longer time courses. I build periodization cycles out over a year time periods. But a lot of times I'm like, I need to keep this person engaged long enough that they're going to make substantial gains to the point where they're bought into the process and they stay doing this. And so if I was to tell someone, hey, listen, for every year of progress, it's going to take you 15 months because we just extended 3 months because you're doing 13 weeks of deloading, or I could get you there in 12 months and I could just auto-regulate things to work around your joint structures and your biofeedback and fatigue indices and sleep and all these other things. They're going to take the year. And so really when it comes down to a practical perspective, I don't think the science, we don't have concrete data on this first and foremost. I think that we overleaned and over-indexed on some of the evidence-based, I guess, paradigms that were put out there. And I'm glad to say that from a coaching perspective, working with people constantly, and just I'm 1,200 plus people into this. You're someone that works with people on a constant basis. We're able to kind of see through some of these models that may not have been tested as hard because they were more conceptual, they're more physiological models, and they weren't really being done on a one-on-one basis with individuals, getting the feedback, looking at the, gauging the response, looking at the progression, and then saying, you know what, this may not be the most optimal approach.
Yeah, like you said, it gets the buy-in for sure. If you're taking too many reps, it's like you said, you're not trying to get somebody to the quickest amount of results as quick as possible. But those things do help build the momentum and people feel better about that. And to, again, like I think with the deload, there's so many different ways to deload. It's not like a black or white. This is how you deload. And again, for some people, it could be deload is you do one less set. And it's like, that's a lot different than if you cut everything, right? So I think that, again, it's hard to know for sure what we're talking about here. The more you take off and like you said, lower intensity, et cetera, that's where it can start to add up. Now, in saying all this, I think the big thing is that we're not saying you can't ever do this. If you have a vacation come up or you're just feeling super beat up and you've trained super hard for a year straight, okay, you're fine at that point, right? Or something, again, you have some sort of event come up that is just, you can't train as hard for a week or two. It's nothing bad's going to happen in that situation either. It's just this regular, hey, you need a deload every 6 weeks that we're talking about here that we have gotten away from. And again, using it on a more auto-regulated approach, looking at, like you said, auto-regulating things, but then also just, is it a progression thing where you just need to temper your expectations around progressions as well to make that less likely that you feel like you need a deload there.
Absolutely, my friend. All right, so we will wrap up for today. This has been a great Q&A podcast, guys. If you love these Q&As or you want a deep dive podcast, the other thing that we're thinking about, I'll just put this out into the ether, doing a full deep dive onto body recomposition potentially for next month. So if you are interested and you're listening to this and you would love a deep dive between Jeff and myself on body recomposition, please do reach out to us. You can DM us at either of our Instagrams. Let us know. We want feedback from us. But as always, guys, thank you so much for joining us for another collaboration episode. You guys can find me at Brandon DaCruz _ on Instagram. You can find me on the Chasing Clarity podcast. And then for any inquiries, any questions you guys have, you can email me at bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. Jeff, where can they find you, my friend?
Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN _ and then Mind Muscle Connection podcast.
Oh, yeah. All right, guys. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
See you guys.